And we have her. Yes.
Hi.
Hello. I think they get.
I'm
I was
sorry
chatting on about
that.
voting rights. Oh, no worries. No worries. These things happen. It's good to have you.
It's so wonderful to be in conversation with you.
Likewise. Well, I'm actually going to let you take it away.
I just want to start by thanking World War Zero for bringing us together in celebration of Earth Day, and that this is, in coordination with the Climate Summit the Biden administration is hosting, and the big new commitment that's been made to have a 50% reduction in U.S. Greenhouse gas emissions compared to 2005 levels by 2030. It's a little bit of complexity in this goal, and obviously there's more beyond that to do. But happy Earth Day!
Happy Earth Day to you. And before we get into the heart of the conversation, I think it's important for people to know just how awesome you are. I was riffing a little bit, but you popped up before I could go into too much detail. But can you just tell folks a little bit more about yourself and why this is a conversation and why this day matters so much?
Yeah, I'm usually like Earth Day, whatever. It's cheesy, but this year I'm like legit excited. I'm like, bring it on. Because it feels like so much more is possible now, right? And in large part because of the opportunity that winning those Georgia Senate seats created. So shout out to you. People don't think about voting as necessarily the way to get voting for senators as the way to get good climate policy in America, but it is. And so making sure people have access to vote is absolutely critical. So I think of your work as climate work, and my work as sort of like more standard climate work. I was trained as a marine biologist. That's what kind of doctor I am. And I have been for the last few years doing work on making sure the ocean is a part of federal climate policy. In the last year, I co-created the Blue New Deal plan to make sure that, complementary to the Green New Deal, we have the ocean included as we think about federal climate solutions, whether that's offshore renewable energy like wind and solar and wave energy, or restoring and protecting coastal ecosystems, which is a big part of the Biden administration's 30 by 30, protecting 30% of nature by 2030 goal, and regenerative farming in the ocean of seaweed and shellfish, and how are we going to modernize our ports, and how do we manage fishing when the fish are moving in search of cooler waters. Like, all of this is changing, and it requires some comprehensive federal policy structure. So that's a lot of what I've been doing through the nonprofit that I co-founded, Urban Ocean Lab. So just sort of like raising my hand for the ocean when I'm in all these meetings about climate. And Stacey, people don't necessarily think of you as a climate leader. They think of you with Fair Fight and Fair Count, but you're also, you also lead the Southern Economic Advancement Project. And I know that that your organization just released a climate report to examine decarbonization policies in Southern states. So I was hoping you could share more about that piece of your work.
Sure. Well, I want to first, I will just sort of anchor myself as someone who cares about the climate. I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico, grew up in Gulfport, Mississippi, and so I've always cared about what was happening around us. I also, because I grew up in Mississippi, grew up near Moss Point, Mississippi, which had a lot of chemical factories, and we were just a stone's throw away from Louisiana and Chemical Alley. And so I grew up really understanding how important the environment was. And in fact, in college, my senior thesis was on environmental racism. And I interned in North Carolina so between my sophomore and junior year, my junior and senior years, I interned for the North Carolina, so for the EPA and their Criterion and Assessment Office in Durham. And then between my senior year and my first year in grad school, I interned for the EPA at the newly created Office of Environmental Justice under the Clinton administration. So long, long ago. But for me, the conversation about the environment has always been directly tied to the conversation of justice. That you cannot speak to wanting progress and wanting access and eviscerating poverty and making lives better and not acknowledge the impact of environmental injustice, environmental racism, and the science that can either make our communities healthier and more vibrant or can be part of our demise. And so when I launched the Southern Economic Advancement Project in 2019, so people know about Fair Fight, which is democracy, our democracy work. Fair Count was about, or is about, making sure that we use the census as a 10-year organizing strategy as opposed to a once a decade, intrusion into our privacy. But the Southern Economic Advancement Project is about looking at the 12-state southern region and thinking about how do we improve access to quality, equity, and economic security. And part of that is the environment. But we have to talk about it differently in the South. That this notion of just rejecting fossil fuels ignores how deeply ingrained it is, not only into how we live our lives, but how so many hundreds of thousands of people make their living. It's about having the conversation about decarbonization, but doing it in a way that doesn't scare people out of the conversation and instead invites people in. And then writ large, we recently started having a conversation about the intersection of environmental action and healthcare equity. That when you are talking to your doctor, you should be having conversations about how the environment is affecting your health and what should be done. And if you are in the medical profession, you should be providing this information. Because especially in the South, we know that it's the change in the water table. It's the change in the oceans that are also changing the intensity of storms. And if you are poor and Southern and you have to suddenly evacuate, if you can't afford to leave, then you are trapped where you are. And that is environmental injustice. And so we have to be so incredibly thoughtful. And why I'm so excited about your work is that you have taken what has often been seen, and let's be really honest, as a conversation that excludes communities of color. And you've not only situated it for people of color, you've situated it in the ocean. And it is such an amazing thing to me as someone who grew up just in love with the water to know. We got to talk about a lot of marine life when I was growing up. There was never a Black marine biologist in front of me, and so I'm excited that I get to do this right now.
We exist. There's a whole bunch of us. There's if folks want to follow more Black marine scientists, there's an account, Black in Marine Science, right here on Instagram, and there's heaps of us.
Give them what's it called?
At Black in Marine Science.
Awesome.
And thank you for those kind words, Stacey. I think the opportunity here is in bringing more and more people into crafting and pushing forward climate solutions, right? When we think about how are we going to solve the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced, the thought that we could do that without people of color is just ridiculous. It's not just who is getting more heavily impacted by the effects of the climate crisis, right? It's not, obviously the disproportionate impacts on communities of color and poor communities are horrific and need to be addressed and prioritized. And it looks like the Biden administration is taking some steps in those directions with committing to 40% of the resources going to disadvantaged communities. Of course, a lot of details to be worked out around that. And I know you'll be keeping your eye on it. And so what that means, though, is that we focus so much on who's the most impacted when we think about this term climate justice and environmental justice. And that is key to rectify that. But we also need to think about who's at the table crafting the solution, right? Are you at the table? Am I at the table? Are communities across the board being represented? And that is a real missed opportunity, because what people do not understand is that communities of color have always cared about the environment, have always been working on this with very few resources, with not enough power to influence the outcomes. And we know that according to polling from Yale and George Mason universities, people of color quantitatively care more, are more concerned about climate, right? It is, in the US, it's about 49% of white Americans who are concerned about climate and the impacts of climate change, 57% of Black Americans, 69% of Latinx Americans. So we want to build the biggest, strongest team to address this existential challenge of our time. We obviously need people of color, right? Like it's just the winning strategy in the same way that that's true for protecting our democracy and when it comes to the right to vote. So it really is all connected.
Not only is it all connected, it makes sense when you think about it. When you consider the intersection of not just poverty and the environment and race, but the long-term implications of housing strategies and transportation strategies that have forced us to think about our environment in ways that many communities don't have to. They haven't been forced to confront this conversation. But when you are trapped in what is essentially a heat tunnel and you can't afford access to air conditioning, or the very air conditioning you rely on is creating more of the challenge that you're trying to solve, it becomes a vicious cycle. And it's so exciting to me that we are in a moment where people of color, and in particular Black scientists and Black people committed to social justice and equity, where communities of color are linking themselves together and saying that we can be a part of not only identifying the problem or worse, serving as examples of the challenge, but we will be at the table creating solutions. And that's why World War Z is so important to me, because part of the opportunity is for us to elevate these conversations and make it such a daily part of our narrative, that we are not seeing this as an ancillary point or a day where we celebrate. I saw someone has a birthday, happy Earth Day. But this is not just about celebrating Earth Day. It is a renewal of our commitment to the justice we deserve, but also our willingness to be part of the being part of the architectural firm and the architectural firmament that builds that new reality.
As the daughter of a Black architect who had arguably the first Black firm in New York City in the 70s, I think a lot about like, how do we literally design the future? And who is building it? Who is deconstructing it? Who is reconstructing it? How are we adapting? And that's when we think about climate solutions, we often think about like solar panels and electric cars, but it's so much more than that, right? We have to change our entire electricity system, our entire transportation system, our agriculture and land use, our manufacturing, our buildings. And that's going to take people with all different skills, right? And so I think of it as like a real opportunity to help shape the future from whatever skills you have and wherever you're sitting, wherever you are in the country. And just everyone finding their role in it. The way that we've really talked about environmental work and climate has often been like, everybody march, everybody vote, everyone spread the word, everyone donate, and of course, like do those things and reduce your own impact on the environment. But we really have to be thinking in these broader, how can we contribute to the systems changes beyond just looking at our individual impacts at home? How can we create these ripples, like whether that's getting behind local candidates who are pushing for really transformative climate policies? Like how can you get involved in making sure we have composting in our communities, or more bike lanes, or our local utility commissions are setting a deadline for getting off fossil fuels, right? There's so many ways that we can make a difference beyond what we're normally sort of narrowly told to worry about. And so I just would encourage folks to think more broadly about what's like special skills you have, like what are your superpowers that you can bring to bear.
Well, and I would love to just highlight a few things in addition to what you've said, other ways you can help. One, if you are we know that because of the American Rescue Plan, $5 billion is going to be poured into Black farmers. Money that is both reparations for past bad behavior, but also an investment in the future. If you know someone who's a Black farmer who is entering that field, having those conversations about how we think intentionally about the land is incredibly important. And that is one piece of it. If you are someone who is concerned about what's happening in your community, then you should be talking to your state representatives about what they're doing with your state dollars around transportation. You should be talking to your state representatives about building codes and making sure that the state and local level, they know you're present. And we know that there's an infrastructure bill that's moving and I want you to talk a little bit about that, but this infrastructure bill can invest billions of dollars into how we reshape our physical space to make certain that what Ayana is referring to becomes real. And in the moment where we have the attention of the world on us, I don't want to leave out the diaspora world, the diaspora conversations that we need to be having. That what we do in the United States, particularly for brown and black people, matters not only to who we are, but to how we have a conversation internationally about where we want to go.
Yes, this American Jobs Plan that the Biden administration sent over to Congress just last week or on Monday, this week, it's all happening so fast, right? To go from an administration that only tore down environmental regulations for 4 years to one that's introducing things faster than I can keep up in executive orders and what's happening in federal agencies is really exciting. And I'd just like to share a few key elements of what are being proposed that are worth people keeping an eye on and advocating to make sure they stay in whatever the final bill looks like. But what's really innovative that the Biden team has done is think about how are we talking about climate and jobs in the context of infrastructure, right? Like this is an infrastructure bill because that's what we need. If we're dealing with sea level rise and storms and droughts and floods and wildfires, that has to do with like how we shape and build on this planet. And what does it look like to build out new electricity and all the jobs that are associated with that and all the jobs in public transit that's being built out and all the jobs in thinking about agriculture and how that needs to shift and in building electric vehicle charging stations and in this concept of a civilian climate corps, of putting people back to work, actually protecting and restoring our ecosystems and reaching this goal of 30 by 30, protecting 30% of nature by 2030, of the land and the ocean, I would add. And so I think that's all of those things are really important, as well as this commitment to 40% of the funds going to historically disadvantaged communities who've been hit so hard. I mean, so much of public housing in New York, where I live, is like in the flood zone. We think about Hurricane Sandy and like who got pummeled the worst by that. So I know we have to wrap up soon, but I would be remiss in not saying, oh my gosh, Nobel Peace Prize nomination.
Oh, no.
And the reason I want to bring that up is something really specific, which is when Black Lives Matter was also nominated, and then reading last night about the news of your nomination, what that reminded me of was the role of the United States as a part of the global community. What we do here in our work for racial justice, in our work to protect our democracy, like changes the world, right? If the US is leading on climate, which it will do if everyone has the right to vote, to really access their vote, because the majority of Americans really want to do something about climate and they see the opportunity for green jobs. And so seeing your work recognized, it just reminded me how important it is, apart from just being like really excited, also reminded me how important it is to show for the US to lead on this, to bring other countries along with us, to acknowledge the history of how we've had the biggest carbon emissions over our history compared to any other nation, and that we really have a responsibility to lead the way forward. And I think seeing Black Lives Matter and you nominated for the Nobel just really cemented that for me, that it really is time for the US to lead by example once again on these things.
Well, I appreciate that, first of all, because I do the work I do, I think, for the same reason you do, because we were raised to believe you're supposed to put your hands to work fixing the things that are broken and need to be made better, but that every one of us has a part to play. And while I am deeply honored by the national or the international recognition, just having my name entered into the conversation, what I'm driven by and what I adore about your work and the work that we see happening is that rather than this being one more set of conversations about what could be, we have an opportunity to make it real. We have a president who is putting intention behind his language and who's investing and driving those dollars. We have demonstrated that when we vote, we can win, and we are fighting to make certain those votes are real. There are going to be those who do their best to stymie, to block, to barricade, or worse, to gaslight us into believing this isn't real. But what is so important to me, and what I want to amplify as we close out, is that Dr. Johnson, what you do and what you represent, that every person who's listening with good heart and good intention, and those who are just listening to troll, if you hear one thing that makes you decide that this Earth Day is going to make you a better part of our larger society, that's going to remind you that we are in this together, then we have done the work we need to do, and we can keep going.
Perfect. I could chat with you forever, so I hope this is the beginning of
absolutely
of many conversations. And I just wanted to thank World War Zero org at World War Zero org here on Instagram for bringing us together for this conversation, helping folks connect the dots between climate and racial justice and economic justice and policy. And we have so much more that's possible now with this administration, people in the White House who get it and want to do the right thing. And that means we get to push really hard from the outside, and then maybe actually see some really beautiful things come out the other side. So this doesn't mean we get to chill, unfortunately.
No, never. But we can't take a small break. So
yeah, I mean, slow and steady wins the race, right?
Absolutely. So check out worldwarzero.org. Check out Dr. Ayana Johnson's podcast. If you want to learn more about what's happening in the South, go to theseep.org. You can download our report. And more than anything, just know that on this Earth Day, we expect to see you keep fighting.
Yes. Happy Earth Day, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you, Stacey.
Likewise, Ayana. It's a pleasure.